The rotors of the UH-60 Blackhawk cut through the pre-dawn darkness as Sarah Chen secured the last cargo strap in the cabin. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking every buckle twice, despite having done this same routine over 3,000 times. The helicopter she was preparing wasn't one of the sleek new UH-60M models lined up on the tarmac at Fort Riverside. This was Dustoff 47, a battle-worn bird from the early production runs, her paint faded and her engines requiring constant attention. But Sarah knew every rivet, every wire, every quirk of this machine better than she knew herself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Chen, you're on cargo duty again today, Captain Mike Rodriguez announced as he strode across the hangar floor, his flight suit crisp and his confidence radiating from every step. Behind him followed Lieutenant Jake Thompson, whose brand-new wings gleamed on his chest like a badge of honor. Real pilots are handling the combat search and rescue training today. Sarah nodded without looking up from her checklist. At 36, she had more flight hours than Rodriguez and Thompson combined, but her logbook was filled with medical evacuations, supply runs, and maintenance test flights, rather than the high-profile combat missions that built careers. She'd been flying helicopters for 14 years, starting as an enlisted crew chief before earning her wings through sheer determination and night school. Every promotion had come slowly, every opportunity had to be fought for, and every achievement seemed to be quickly forgotten by those who mattered. The North Carolina morning was crisp as Sarah watched the primary mission aircraft taxi toward the runway. Eagle Ridge Training Facility waited 30 miles to the west, where today's exercise would simulate a downed aircraft recovery in hostile territory. The scenario was complex, demanding precision flying through mountain valleys while coordinating with ground forces and medical teams. It was exactly the kind of mission Sarah had been training for, studying for, and requesting assignment to for the past 2 years. Instead, she would be hauling supplies to the forward operating base, a milk run that any qualified pilot could handle with their eyes closed. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd been specifically requested for this cargo mission because of her reputation for never missing a delivery, never damaging equipment, and never causing paperwork headaches for the operations staff. Her reliability had become her cage. Lieutenant Thompson paused at her aircraft as the primary mission birds lifted off. "Don't worry, Chen," he called out, with the casual condescension that younger officers seem to specialize in. "Maybe next year you'll be ready for the real missions." His comment drew chuckles from the ground crew, but Sarah had heard variations of this dismissal so many times that it barely registered anymore. What Thompson didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Sarah spent her off-duty hours studying every aspect of combat search and rescue operations. Her small apartment near the base was filled with technical manuals, terrain maps, and weather data from every training area within 200 miles of Fort Riverside. She knew the radio frequencies, the standard operating procedures, the capabilities and limitations of every aircraft in their fleet. She understood mountain flying better than pilots who'd been doing it for half as long, having grown up in the Colorado Rockies, where her father had taught her to read wind patterns and atmospheric conditions before she could drive a car. Her flight bag contained detailed notes on high-altitude operations, auto-rotation procedures in confined areas, and night vision goggle limitations that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. While other pilots relied on their natural talent and standard training, Sarah had made herself an expert in the technical aspects that others found boring or unnecessary. She knew that her methodical approach was seen as overcautious, her careful planning dismissed as excessive, but she also knew that emergencies didn't wait for ideal conditions or second chances. The cargo mission proceeded without incident, as Sarah's missions always did. She delivered medical supplies to the forward operating base, transported maintenance personnel to a communication relay station, and completed her paperwork with the same attention to detail that characterized everything she did. By the time she returned to Fort Riverside, the primary mission aircraft were already back, their crews celebrating another successful training exercise in the pilot lounge. Sarah was securing Dustoff 47 in the hangar when Master Sergeant Tony Williams approached with a maintenance discrepancy form. Williams was one of the few people on base who understood Sarah's capabilities, having worked with her for 6 years and witnessed her handle aircraft emergencies that would have rattled more experienced pilots. "Chen," he said, keeping his voice low, I need you to look at something." He led her to his office behind the maintenance bay, where computer screens displayed real-time status reports from the entire helicopter fleet. Williams pulled up the mission data from that day's training exercise, his expression troubled. "Look at these performance metrics," he said, pointing to columns of numbers that tracked fuel consumption, flight time efficiency, and mission completion statistics. Sarah studied the data, her analytical mind immediately recognizing patterns that told a disturbing story. The primary mission aircraft had completed their objectives, but their performance showed significant inefficiencies. Excessive fuel consumption suggested poor flight planning, extended mission times indicated navigation problems, and the radio logs revealed multiple communication breakdowns that had been glossed over in the official reports. "They got lucky today," Williams continued. "Perfect weather, clear visibility, minimal wind. But look at this." He switched to a different screen showing weather forecasts for the coming week. A major storm system was approaching from the west, bringing low clouds, mountain turbulence, and the kind of conditions that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. "General Hayes is visiting next week for the final evaluation," Williams explained. "He's bringing congressional staffers and defense contractors to witness our readiness demonstration. Captain Rodriguez is planning to showcase the same mission profile, but with this weather system coming in, those pretty boys are going to be in over their heads." Sarah nodded, understanding the implications. General Robert Hayes was responsible for aviation training standards across multiple installations, and his evaluation would determine funding, equipment upgrades, and the future direction of the program at Fort Riverside. A failed demonstration wouldn't just embarrass Captain Rodriguez, it could impact the careers and resources of everyone on the base. "What are you suggesting, Sergeant?" Sarah asked. Though she suspected she already knew the answer, Williams turned to face her directly. "I'm suggesting that when this demonstration goes sideways, and it will go sideways, they're going to need a pilot who knows how to fly in weather that doesn't exist in the training manuals. Someone who understands that pretty flight plans don't work when the mountains are trying to kill you." That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment reviewing the weather data and mission profiles for the upcoming demonstration. The storm system was more severe than the official forecast indicated, with winds that would create dangerous downdrafts in the mountain valleys and cloud layers that would challenge even experienced instrument pilots. She pulled out her detailed topographical maps of Eagle Ridge, marking potential landing zones, escape routes, and areas where radio communication would be degraded or impossible. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her sister in Colorado. "Saw the weather forecast for your area. Those mountains. Don't forgive mistakes. Stay safe." Sarah smiled at the familiar warning. Her family had been flying and living in mountain terrain for 3 generations, and they'd taught her that survival depended on respecting conditions that others might underestimate. She opened her flight bag and reviewed her personal emergency procedures, the detailed checklists she'd developed through years of flying in marginal conditions. While other pilots memorized standard procedures, Sarah had created backup plans for scenarios that weren't covered in the official manuals. She knew which ridgelines created the worst turbulence, which valleys could trap an aircraft in downdrafts, and which radio frequencies might still work when primary communications failed. The next morning brought confirmation of Sarah's concerns. Lieutenant Thompson returned from a routine training flight looking shaken, reporting severe turbulence and navigation difficulties that had forced him to abort his mission early. Captain Rodriguez dismissed the incident as pilot inexperience, but Sarah recognized the signs of weather conditions that were already deteriorating faster than forecasted. She made a decision that would change everything. Walking into Captain Rodriguez's office, she requested permission to brief the demonstration flight crews on mountain weather flying techniques. Rodriguez looked up from his desk with barely concealed irritation. "Chen, stick to cargo operations. The demonstration crews have been training for this mission for months." "Sir, with respect, the weather conditions are going to be significantly more challenging than anything they've trained for," Sarah replied calmly. "I have extensive experience flying in mountain weather, and I believe I could provide valuable insights that might prevent mission failure or worse." Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from irritation to something approaching amusement. "Chen, you're a cargo pilot. You fly supply runs in perfect weather when the real pilots are busy with important missions. What makes you think you're qualified to advise combat search and rescue crews?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah had heard variations of this dismissal countless times, But something about the approaching demonstration and the weather conditions made her push back harder than usual. "Sir, I've been flying helicopters for 14 years, with over 3,000 hours in mountainous terrain. I've completed emergency landings in conditions that grounded other aircraft, and I've never failed to complete a mission due to weather." "That's because you don't get real missions," Rodriguez shot back. "Flying medical supplies to a forward operating base isn't the same as combat search and rescue. Until you've proven yourself in actual challenging operations, your opinion on flight planning isn't needed or wanted." Sarah left the office knowing that her concerns had been not just dismissed but actively rejected. Captain Rodriguez had made it clear that her experience was considered irrelevant, her expertise unwelcome, and her position in the aviation hierarchy firmly established. She was the reliable cargo pilot who handled routine missions so that real pilots could focus on important operations. But as she walked across the flight line toward Dustoff 47, Sarah made a decision that would prove more significant than anyone could have imagined. She began preparing her aircraft not just for routine cargo operations, but for the possibility that reliable, methodical, and supposedly unimportant Sarah Chen might suddenly become the most important pilot on the base. The weather was deteriorating faster than anyone expected, and Sarah had a feeling that the demonstration mission would become something far more serious than a routine training exercise. She'd spent 14 years being told she wasn't good enough for challenging operations, but she'd also spent those same 14 years becoming exactly the kind of pilot who could handle challenges that pretty flight plans and natural talent couldn't overcome. The storm system that had been tracking toward Fort Riverside. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Arrived 2 days ahead of schedule, transforming the planned demonstration from a routine training exercise into something far more serious. Sarah Chen watched from the hangar as thick clouds rolled over the North Carolina mountains, bringing with them the kind of weather that turned competent pilots into statistics. The windsocks snapped frantically in gusts that exceeded the operational limits of most aircraft, and the visibility dropped to levels that would challenge even the most sophisticated navigation systems. General Robert Hayes had arrived the previous evening with his entourage of congressional staffers and defense contractors, all eager to witness the cutting-edge capabilities of the Fort Riverside aviation program. The demonstration had been planned as a showcase of rapid response capabilities, featuring complex search and rescue scenarios that would highlight the skill and training of the unit's pilots. Captain Rodriguez had spent weeks preparing, selecting his best crews and planning mission profiles that would impress the visiting dignitaries. But weather, as Sarah had learned long ago, didn't care about important visitors or carefully planned demonstrations. The storm system brought with it not just poor visibility and strong winds, but also the kind of mountain turbulence that could flip an aircraft without warning, and downdrafts that could slam a helicopter into the ground before the pilot even realized what was happening. Sarah stood in the maintenance hangar, watching Lieutenant Thompson and his crew examine the latest weather reports with expressions of growing concern. The official briefing showed conditions that were technically within operational limits, but Sarah's years of mountain flying experience told her a different story. She could see in the wind patterns and cloud formations the signature of a weather system that was going to be far more dangerous than the meteorologists predicted. "We can handle this," Thompson announced to his crew, his voice carrying the confidence of youth and inexperience. "The weather's marginal, but we've trained for worse conditions than this." His co-pilot nodded agreement, though Sarah noticed the uncertainty in his eyes. These were good pilots, but they were trained in standard procedures for standard conditions, and what was developing outside was anything but standard. Captain Rodriguez appeared in the hangar doorway, his face tight with the stress of having to maintain the demonstration schedule despite increasingly hazardous conditions. "All crews report to the briefing room in 15 minutes, he announced. "We're proceeding with the demonstration as planned. General Hayes didn't come here to watch us ground aircraft because of a little weather." Sarah knew she should keep quiet, should focus on her assigned cargo mission, and let the demonstration crews handle their own responsibilities. But she also knew that a little weather could easily turn into a catastrophic accident that would end careers and possibly lives. She made a decision that went against every instinct for self-preservation she'd developed during her military career. "Captain Rodriguez," she called out as he prepared to leave the hangar. "Sir, I need to speak with you about the weather conditions." Rodriguez stopped and turned, his expression already showing irritation at being delayed by the cargo pilot, who couldn't seem to understand her place in the hierarchy. "Chen, unless you're reporting a maintenance issue with your aircraft, I don't have time for this conversation," Rodriguez said curtly. The demonstration crews have been briefed on weather conditions, and they're prepared for the mission. "Sir, the weather briefing doesn't account for mountain wave activity and downdraft patterns that are developing in the target area," Sarah replied calmly. "The wind conditions are creating hazards that aren't showing up on standard weather reports, but they could be fatal to aircraft operating in the mountain valleys." Rodriguez's patience finally snapped. "Specialist Chen, you are a cargo pilot with no combat search and rescue experience, no advanced weather training, and no authority to second-guess mission planning decisions made by qualified officers. Your job is to fly supplies from point A to point B in perfect weather conditions. Leave the complex flying to pilots who are actually qualified for it." The words stung, because they contained just enough truth to hurt, while completely missing the larger picture. Sarah was indeed a cargo pilot, and she had been relegated to routine missions for most of her career. But what Rodriguez didn't understand, what he had never bothered to learn, was that those routine missions had given her an education in practical flying that no amount of advanced training could provide. While other pilots learned to fly in controlled environments with backup systems and safety nets, Sarah had learned to fly alone, in weather that other pilots avoided, to places that other pilots wouldn't go. She'd made emergency landings on mountain ridges in zero visibility, navigated through valleys in conditions that grounded more experienced crews, and completed missions that existed on the edge of what was technically possible. Her methodical approach wasn't the result of limited ability. It was the product of understanding just how quickly aviation could kill you if you made assumptions about your own capabilities. The briefing room filled with the demonstration crews, support personnel, and observers from General Hayes's party. The mission profile was ambitious, a simulated search and rescue operation in the Eagle Ridge training area involving multiple aircraft, ground coordination, and medical evacuation procedures. Under normal conditions, it would be a routine exercise for experienced pilots. But Sarah could see through the windows that conditions were anything but normal. Lieutenant Thompson stood at the front of the room, projecting confidence as he outlined the flight routes and coordination procedures. His planning was textbook perfect, following standard operating procedures and established safety protocols. But Sarah noticed what the others missed. The flight paths took the aircraft directly through valleys where the current wind conditions would create severe downdrafts, and the timing put the most critical phases of the mission during the period when visibility was forecast to deteriorate rapidly. "Weather conditions are marginal but acceptable," Thompson announced, displaying the official forecast on the briefing room screen. "We have backup plans for various contingencies, and all crews are prepared for instrument flight conditions if visibility decreases." Sarah felt a growing sense of dread as she listened to the briefing. Everything being discussed was technically correct and procedurally sound, but it was also based on assumptions about weather conditions that her experience told her were dangerously optimistic. She'd seen this kind of overconfidence before, usually right before weather-related accidents that could have been prevented if someone had been willing to acknowledge that standard procedures might not be adequate for non-standard conditions. As the briefing concluded and the crews began their pre-flight preparations, Sarah made one last attempt to inject some reality into the proceedings. She approached Thompson as he reviewed his navigation charts, hoping that pilot-to-pilot communication might be more effective than the formal chain of command had proven to be. "Jake," she said quietly, using his first name to signal that this was a personal conversation rather than an official one. "I've been flying in these mountains for 6 years, and I've seen this type of weather system before. The conditions are going to be worse than the forecast indicates, and they're going to deteriorate faster than anyone expects." Thompson looked up from his charts with the patient expression of someone humoring a colleague they didn't quite respect. "Sarah, I appreciate your concern, but we've done extensive weather planning for this mission. The meteorology section has provided detailed forecasts, and we have multiple contingency plans if conditions change." "The meteorology section doesn't understand mountain flying," Sarah replied, keeping her voice level despite her growing frustration. "They're using standard forecasting models that don't account for terrain effects and local wind patterns. The conditions you're going to encounter in the valleys will be significantly more dangerous than anything showing up on their computer models." Thompson's expression shifted from patience to mild irritation. "Sarah, with all due respect, you fly cargo missions in perfect weather. This crew has been training for combat search and rescue operations for over a year. We know how to handle challenging conditions." It was the same dismissal she'd been hearing for years, wrapped in the kind of polite language that made it clear the conversation was over. Sarah nodded and stepped back, understanding that she'd done everything she could to warn them through official and unofficial channels. The demonstration would proceed as planned, with crews who were confident in their abilities and weather conditions that were going to be far more dangerous than anyone was prepared to acknowledge. But Sarah wasn't done yet. As she walked back toward Dustoff 47, she made a series of decisions that would prove crucial in the hours to come. She began preparing her aircraft not just for the routine cargo mission she'd been assigned, but for the possibility that she might be called upon to do something far more challenging and important than anyone expected. She loaded extra medical supplies, additional fuel, and emergency equipment that wasn't standard for cargo operations. She programmed backup radio frequencies into her communication system and updated her navigation equipment with detailed terrain data for the entire Eagle Ridge area. Most importantly, she reviewed her personal emergency procedures and prepared herself mentally for the kind of flying that existed beyond the boundaries of standard training and regulation. As the demonstration aircraft lifted off into deteriorating weather conditions, Sarah completed her own pre-flight checks with the methodical thoroughness that had characterized her entire career. She had no way of knowing that within 3 hours her supposedly routine cargo mission would become the most important flight of her life, and that the skills and preparation that others had dismissed as excessive would prove to be the difference between life and death for 47 soldiers who were about to find themselves in a situation that no amount of advanced training had prepared them for. The morning sky was already showing signs of the storm's approach as Sarah watched the demonstration flight disappear into the gray clouds hanging over the mountains. She could only hope that her warnings had been unnecessary, that the mission would proceed smoothly and her concerns would prove to be the overcautious worries of a pilot who'd spent too many years thinking about everything that could go wrong. But she also knew that hope wasn't a strategy, and that when things went bad in mountain flying, they went bad quickly and completely. She started the engines of Dustoff 47 and began her own mission, staying close to the radio frequencies that would carry the first signs of trouble if her fears proved justified. Sarah's cargo mission to the forward supply depot proceeded without incident for the first 40 minutes, but she could feel the weather deteriorating around her with each passing mile. The wind patterns she'd been monitoring all morning were intensifying exactly as she'd predicted, creating turbulence that buffeted Dustoff 47 even at her conservative cruising altitude. Through her headset, she monitored the radio chatter from the demonstration mission, listening for any signs that the crews were encountering the conditions she'd warned them about. The first indication of trouble came as a brief transmission that cut through the static. "Eagle Flight, be advised we're encountering moderate to severe turbulence in the primary corridor." Lieutenant Thompson's voice carried the tension of a pilot dealing with conditions that were worse than expected but still within the realm of manageable. Sarah adjusted her own flight path to avoid the worst of the turbulence, using terrain features and wind patterns that her years of mountain flying had taught her to read like a roadmap. 20 minutes later, the radio traffic became more urgent. "Base operations, Eagle Flight requesting immediate weather update for the target area. Visibility is dropping rapidly and we're experiencing significant downdrafts." This time Thompson's voice had lost its earlier confidence, replaced by the clipped professionalism that pilots used when things were starting to go seriously wrong. Sarah completed her cargo delivery and was preparing for the return flight to Fort Riverside when the emergency call that would change everything crackled through her headset. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Eagle Flight Lead. We have experienced a controlled flight into terrain. Aircraft is down in Sector 7 of Eagle Ridge training area. We have multiple casualties and require immediate medical evacuation." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Controlled flight into terrain was aviation terminology for what everyone understood, but nobody wanted to say directly. The aircraft had flown into the ground because the crew couldn't see where they were going. In the deteriorating weather conditions she'd tried to warn them about, the demonstration flight had become disoriented and crashed into the mountainside. "Eagle Flight Lead, base operations. Confirm your position and status," came the response from the operations center, the controller's voice maintaining professional calm despite the gravity of the situation. "Base operations, we are approximately 2 miles southeast of Checkpoint Charlie in Sector 7. Aircraft is a total loss. We have 47 personnel on board, including aircrew. Multiple injuries, some critical. We need immediate medical evacuation, but weather conditions are below minimums for standard operations. Sarah felt her stomach drop as the full implications became clear. 47 people were stranded on a mountainside in weather conditions that were deteriorating by the minute, with injuries that required immediate medical attention. The standard search and rescue aircraft would be grounded by the weather conditions, and even if they could launch, the terrain in Sector 7 was notoriously difficult for helicopter operations even in perfect conditions. All aircraft, base operations. Be advised that weather conditions have deteriorated below operational minimums for search and rescue operations. We are coordinating with regional assets for possible ground-based evacuation. The words that followed were the ones that Sarah had been dreading. Estimated response time for ground evacuation is 6 to 8 hours minimum. 6 to 8 hours for critically injured personnel in a mountain environment with freezing temperatures and worsening weather conditions meant that people were going to die. Sarah knew the terrain around Checkpoint Charlie intimately, having flown supply missions to nearby locations dozens of times. The area was accessible by ground vehicles, but only through mountain roads that would be increasingly dangerous as the weather deteriorated. By the time ground-based rescue teams could reach the crash site, organize medical triage, and begin evacuating casualties, the situation would have transitioned from emergency to tragedy. Sarah made a decision that went against every regulation, every standard operating procedure, and every piece of advice she'd ever been given about risk management in aviation. She switched her radio to the emergency frequency and transmitted directly to the operations center. Base operations. This is Dustoff 47. I am currently airborne in the Eagle Ridge area and request permission to attempt a medical evacuation of Eagle Flight personnel. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When the response came, it was Captain Rodriguez's voice, and his tone made it clear that Sarah's offer was not welcome. Dustoff 47, negative. Weather conditions are below minimums for all aircraft operations in that area. Return to base immediately. Base operations. I am familiar with the terrain and weather patterns in Sector 7. I believe I can safely reach the crash site and begin medical evacuation procedures. Dustoff 47, you are ordered to return to base immediately. Weather conditions are below minimums for all operations. Sarah understood the position that Captain Rodriguez was in. Officially, he was correct, that weather conditions were below the minimum standards for helicopter operations. Allowing her to attempt a rescue mission in those conditions would be a career-ending decision if something went wrong. But Sarah also understood something that Rodriguez didn't: the difference between regulation minimums and actual operational capabilities when lives were at stake. She had spent years flying in conditions that other pilots avoided, learning to read weather patterns and terrain features that weren't covered in standard training programs. Her methodical approach to flight planning and her conservative operating procedures weren't signs of limited ability. They were the tools that would allow her to operate safely in conditions that would ground other aircraft. Base operations, Dustoff 47. I understand the weather conditions and I accept full responsibility for this mission. 47 people are going to die if we don't get them off that mountain. The radio fell silent again, and Sarah could imagine the heated discussion taking place in the operations center. Captain Rodriguez would be arguing for following standard procedures and waiting for ground-based rescue. Master Sergeant Williams might be pointing out that Sarah had more experience flying in marginal weather than anyone else on the base. And somewhere in the background, General Hayes and his entourage would be witnessing a demonstration of military aviation that was very different from what they had expected to see. When the response came, it was Colonel Jennifer Walsh's voice, and her words carried the weight of command authority that would end the discussion. Dustoff 47, this is Colonel Walsh. You are authorized to proceed with medical evacuation operations in Sector 7. Be advised that this authorization is given with full understanding of weather conditions and terrain hazards. Godspeed. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror as she acknowledged the authorization and began turning Dustoff 47 toward the crash site. She was about to attempt a mission that every regulation said was impossible, in weather conditions that had already caused one aircraft to crash, to a location that was difficult to reach even in perfect conditions. But she was also the only pilot currently airborne who had the experience and equipment necessary to have any chance of success. The flight to Sector 7 took 18 minutes that felt like hours. Sarah flew at minimum altitude, using terrain features to shield her aircraft from the worst of the wind and turbulence while following valleys and ridgelines that she knew from memory. The visibility continued to deteriorate, forcing her to rely increasingly on instruments and her detailed knowledge of the terrain to avoid the same fate that had befallen the demonstration flight. As she approached the area around Checkpoint Charlie, Sarah began the most challenging phase of the mission, locating the crash site in conditions that made visual navigation nearly impossible. She switched to the emergency frequency and attempted to establish direct communication with the survivors. Eagle Flight Lead, this is Dustoff 47. I am approaching your area for medical evacuation. Can you mark your position? Dustoff 47, Eagle Flight. We can hear your aircraft but cannot see you due to cloud cover. Our position is approximately half a mile southeast of Checkpoint Charlie on a ridgeline at about 4,500 feet elevation. Sarah processed this information against her mental map of the terrain, realizing that the crash site was located on one of the most challenging landing zones in the entire training area. The ridgeline was narrow, with steep drop-offs on both sides and terrain that would make a conventional helicopter landing extremely difficult, even in perfect weather conditions. Eagle Flight Dustoff 47, I need you to prepare casualties for evacuation. Priority will be given to most critical injuries first. How many personnel can walk and assist with loading? Dustoff 47. We have approximately 15 personnel who are ambulatory. The rest have injuries ranging from minor to critical. We have at least 6 casualties who require immediate medical attention. Sarah began her approach to the crash site, using every technique she'd learned for flying in marginal weather conditions. She flew slowly and deliberately, constantly cross-checking her instruments against terrain features she could barely see through the clouds and precipitation. The wind was gusting from multiple directions as it was deflected by the mountain ridges, creating turbulence that required constant control inputs to maintain stable flight. When she finally spotted the wreckage through a brief break in the clouds, Sarah felt her heart sink. The demonstration aircraft had impacted the ridge at a steep angle, coming apart on impact and scattering debris across a slope that was almost too steep for safe helicopter operations. Smoke was rising from multiple locations, and she could see personnel moving around the crash site in what appeared to be organized rescue efforts. The landing zone itself was a nightmare, a narrow section of relatively flat ground that was barely large enough for her aircraft, with steep slopes on both sides and power lines from a communication facility visible through the murk. Any mistake in the approach or landing would result in her aircraft joining the wreckage already scattered across the mountainside. Sarah began her approach with the methodical precision that had characterized her entire flying career. She called out her altitude, airspeed, and position to maintain situational awareness while monitoring engine parameters and flight controls for any sign of problems. The wind was causing severe turbulence that required constant corrections, and the visibility was so poor that she had to rely primarily on instruments and brief glimpses of terrain features to guide her approach. Eagle Flight, Dustoff 47, I am beginning my approach to your position. Have your most critical casualties ready for immediate loading. This is going to be a fast turnaround due to weather conditions. Dustoff 47, understood. We have 6 critical casualties prepared for evacuation. As Sarah brought Dustoff 47 down through the clouds toward the improvised landing zone, she realized that she was attempting something that would have been considered impossible by the standards of conventional helicopter operations. The weather conditions were below minimum operational limits, the terrain was unsuitable for normal landing procedures, and the consequences of failure would be catastrophic not just for herself, but for the 47 people whose lives now depended on her ability to do what everyone had said she couldn't do. But Sarah had spent her entire career preparing for exactly this moment, even though she hadn't known it at the time. Every supply mission in marginal weather, every emergency landing in challenging terrain, every hour spent studying weather patterns and terrain features had been building toward this single flight, where all of her experience and expertise would be tested against conditions that existed beyond the boundaries of standard training and regulation. The landing itself was a masterpiece of precision, flying under impossible conditions. Sarah used the wind patterns and terrain features to her advantage, making a steep approach that brought her aircraft down into the landing zone with minimal forward momentum. The touchdown was firm but controlled, and she immediately began the procedures for rapid casualty loading while keeping the engines running and the rotors turning. The scene around the crash site was organized chaos as the uninjured survivors worked to load the most critical casualties into her aircraft. Sarah could see the extent of the injuries and realized that she would need to make multiple trips to evacuate everyone, each one requiring her to navigate the same dangerous conditions that had nearly killed her on the approach. "Load them quickly," she called out to the loading team. "Weather conditions are deteriorating, and I need to get these casualties to medical facilities immediately." The first load consisted of 6 personnel with critical injuries, strapped into litters, and monitored by a medic who would accompany them during the evacuation flight. As the loading was completed, Sarah began her departure from the landing zone, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether the rescue mission would succeed or whether she would become another casualty in what was already a tragic day. The departure from the ridge was even more challenging than the approach had been. Sarah had to lift off in a confined area with limited maneuvering room, climb through deteriorating weather conditions, and navigate back to Fort Riverside, while monitoring the condition of critically injured passengers who needed immediate medical attention. But as Dustoff 47 climbed away from the crash site and began the flight back to base, Sarah felt a sense of purpose that she had never experienced in 14 years of flying routine missions. For the first time in her career, she was doing exactly what she had always known she was capable of. Flying a mission that required every skill she had developed, every lesson she had learned, and every technique she had perfected during years of being told that her cautious approach and methodical procedures weren't suitable for important operations. The weather continued to deteriorate during the return flight, but Sarah's careful flight planning and conservative approach allowed her to navigate safely through conditions that would have grounded less experienced pilots. She delivered the first load of casualties to the medical facilities at Fort Riverside and immediately began preparing for her return to the crash site, knowing that 41 people were still stranded on the mountain in conditions that were getting worse by the hour. As she lifted off for her second trip, Sarah realized that the cargo pilot who had been dismissed as too slow, too cautious, and too methodical was about to prove that sometimes the most important missions required exactly those qualities that others had seen as limitations. The demonstration that was supposed to showcase the capabilities of Fort Riverside's elite pilots had instead become a testament to the value of experience, preparation, and the kind of flying that existed beyond the boundaries of regulation and standard procedure. But the most challenging part of the mission was still ahead, and Sarah knew that each subsequent trip to the crash site would be more dangerous than the last as weather conditions continued to deteriorate and her own fatigue began to accumulate. The woman who had spent her career being overlooked and underestimated was about to discover just how much she was truly capable of when everything depended on her ability to do what everyone said couldn't be done. The second trip to the crash site revealed conditions that had deteriorated beyond anything Sarah had encountered in her 14 years of flying. The cloud ceiling had dropped to less than 300 feet above the ridgeline, and the wind was gusting to nearly 40 knots with sudden directional changes that could flip an aircraft without warning. Ice was beginning to form on her windscreen despite the heating systems, and the visibility had dropped to the point where she was flying primarily on instruments with only brief glimpses of terrain features to confirm her position. But 41 people were still on that mountain, and the weather forecast showed no signs of improvement for the next 12 hours. Ground-based rescue teams had been forced to turn back when their vehicles couldn't navigate the mountain roads in the deteriorating conditions, and no other aircraft were capable of operating in the current weather. Sarah was the only hope those people had of getting off the mountain alive. As she approached the crash site for her second landing, Sarah discovered that the situation had become significantly more complex. The wind patterns around the ridgeline had shifted, creating downdrafts that threatened to slam her aircraft into the mountainside without warning. The narrow landing zone was now partially obscured by blowing snow and debris, making it nearly impossible to judge distances and clearances during the approach. Eagle Flight. Dustoff 47, I'm beginning my second approach. How are the remaining casualties? Dustoff 47, we've lost 2 more personnel to their injuries. We have 4 additional critical casualties ready for immediate evacuation, and the remaining personnel are showing signs of hypothermia. The temperature is dropping rapidly, and we don't have adequate shelter for everyone. Sarah processed this information as she maneuvered through the treacherous approach to the landing zone. Time was running out for the survivors, and each trip was becoming more dangerous as conditions continued to worsen. She would need to make at least 3 more trips to evacuate everyone, assuming her aircraft could continue operating in conditions that were pushing the limits of what was mechanically possible. The second landing was harder than the first, requiring Sarah to fight crosswinds that tried to push her aircraft off the narrow ridgeline while dealing with visibility so poor that she couldn't see the ground until she was almost touching it. The loading process was complicated by the deteriorating weather, with personnel struggling to move casualties through snow and wind that made every action difficult and dangerous. Master Sergeant Tony Williams had arrived at the crash site on the first evacuation flight and was now coordinating the loading operations with the efficiency that had made him one of the most respected maintenance personnel on the base. His presence added a level of organization and expertise that was crucial for the rapid turnarounds that the weather conditions demanded. "Chen," Williams called out as the loading was completed, "fuel consumption is going to be critical for the remaining trips. The headwinds are eating into your reserves faster than normal, and you're going to need every pound of fuel to make it back with full loads." Sarah nodded, appreciating Williams's understanding of the technical challenges she was facing. The combination of high altitude, adverse weather conditions, and maximum payload was pushing her aircraft to its operational limits. Each trip required careful fuel management and precise flight planning to ensure she could complete the evacuation without running out of fuel over mountainous terrain and instrument conditions. The second load of casualties included some of the most seriously injured survivors, personnel who needed immediate surgical intervention if they were going to survive. Sarah could see the medic working frantically to stabilize patients during the loading process, knowing that the 30-minute flight back to Fort Riverside might be the difference between life and death for several of the casualties. As Dustoff 47 lifted off from the ridgeline for the second time, Sarah encountered the worst turbulence of the mission. The aircraft was buffeted by wind shear that caused rapid altitude changes and violent sideways movements that threatened to exceed the structural limits of the helicopter. She fought the controls with both hands, using every technique she had learned for flying in severe turbulence, while monitoring the condition of critically injured passengers who couldn't tolerate violent maneuvering. The flight back to Fort Riverside was a masterclass in instrument flying under adverse conditions. Sarah navigated through cloud layers that completely obscured the terrain, using radio navigation aids and her detailed knowledge of the mountain topography to maintain safe clearance from obstacles she couldn't see. The radio communications were increasingly difficult, as atmospheric conditions interfered with signal propagation, forcing her to relay position reports through other aircraft, when direct communication with base operations became impossible. At Fort Riverside, the medical personnel were prepared for the arriving casualties with a level of efficiency that reflected the seriousness of the situation. General Hayes had taken direct control of the medical coordination efforts, ensuring that surgical teams and critical care specialists were standing by to treat the most seriously injured personnel as soon as they arrived. "Outstanding work, Chen," Colonel Walsh said as Sarah prepared for her third trip to the crash site. "How are you holding up?" Sarah paused in her pre-flight checks to consider the question honestly. Physical fatigue was beginning to accumulate from the stress of flying in challenging conditions, but more importantly, she was dealing with the psychological pressure of knowing that any mistake could result in the loss of her own life and the deaths of everyone still stranded on the mountain. "I'm managing, ma'am. The aircraft is performing well, and I know the terrain. I can continue as long as necessary." Colonel Walsh studied Sarah's face, recognizing the determination that had characterized her entire military career. "The weather forecast shows continued deterioration for the next several hours. If conditions become too dangerous, I want you to abort the mission and preserve aircraft and crew. We can't risk losing you and having no rescue capability at all." Sarah understood the logic behind the order, but she also understood that the people on the mountain didn't have several hours to wait for improved conditions. The temperature was dropping below freezing, and hypothermia would begin claiming lives long before weather conditions improved enough for conventional rescue operations. "Yes, ma'am. I'll continue as long as it's safe to do so." The third trip to the crash site tested every skill Sarah had developed during her aviation career. The weather had deteriorated to the point where even instrument flight was challenging, with icing conditions that threatened to disrupt her navigation equipment and winds that made precise maneuvering nearly impossible. The approach to the landing zone required her to descend through clouds while avoiding terrain features she couldn't see, relying on timing and memory to navigate safely to the ridgeline. When she finally broke through the cloud layer above the crash site, Sarah was horrified by what she saw. The survivors had been forced to seek shelter behind the wreckage of their aircraft, as the weather conditions made it impossible to remain in the open. Several personnel were showing obvious signs of hypothermia, and it was clear that time was running out for everyone who remained on the mountain. Eagle Flight, Dustoff 47, I'm on final approach. Have your next load ready for immediate departure. Dustoff 47, we have 6 personnel ready for evacuation. Be advised that several of our remaining people are showing severe signs of cold exposure. We need to get everyone off this mountain as quickly as possible. The third landing was the most challenging yet, requiring Sarah to set down on a landing zone that was now partially covered with snow and debris blown by the increasing winds. The visibility was so poor that she had to rely on personnel on the ground to guide her final approach, trusting their judgment about clearances and obstacles that she couldn't see from the cockpit. The loading process for the third evacuation was hampered by the condition of the remaining survivors, many of whom required assistance to move from their shelter to the aircraft. Williams and the other uninjured personnel worked with desperate efficiency, knowing that each minute spent on the ground increased the risk for everyone involved. "Chen, we've got a problem," Williams called out during the loading process. Several of the remaining personnel are hypothermic to the point where they're going to need medical attention during the flight. The medic is staying with this load, which means the next trip won't have medical support during evacuation. Sarah processed this information while monitoring weather conditions that continued to deteriorate around them. The final evacuation would involve personnel who were in critical condition from cold exposure, and she would have to transport them without medical support during a flight that was becoming increasingly dangerous. "How many more trips do we need?" she asked. 2 more loads should get everyone, but the people we're leaving for last are in bad shape. Some of them might not survive the wait. Sarah made a decision that reflected the same methodical thinking that had characterized her entire approach to aviation. Instead of attempting to maintain the established pattern of 6 personnel per trip, she would modify her loading to take more people on each remaining flight, accepting increased risk to her aircraft in order to reduce the total time required for evacuation. "Load 8 people on this trip," she called out. "I can handle the additional weight, and it'll get us down to 1 more flight instead of 2. Williams hesitated for a moment, understanding the implications of Sarah's decision. Operating with maximum payload in the current weather conditions would push her aircraft beyond recommended limits, but it would also reduce the exposure time for the remaining survivors. "You sure about this, Chen? That's going to put you right at the edge of performance limits." "I'm sure. Load them up." The third departure from the ridgeline was harrowing. With 8 personnel on board instead of the planned 6, Dustoff 47 was operating at maximum gross weight in conditions that demanded peak performance from both aircraft and pilot. Sarah had to use every technique she knew for high-altitude operations in adverse weather, carefully managing engine power and flight controls to maintain safe flight in conditions that left no margin for error. The return flight to Fort Riverside was a test of both mechanical reliability and pilot skill. The aircraft was operating at the limits of its performance envelope, struggling to maintain altitude in air that was thin and turbulent. Sarah monitored engine parameters constantly, watching for any signs of problems that could force an emergency landing in terrain that offered no safe options. But Dustoff 47 performed flawlessly, testament to the years of meticulous maintenance that Sarah and Williams had invested in keeping the older aircraft in peak condition. The engines ran smoothly despite the demanding conditions, and the flight controls responded predictably even when operating at maximum weight in severe turbulence. As she delivered the third load of evacuees to Fort Riverside, Sarah realized that she had already accomplished something that would have been considered impossible just hours earlier. She had successfully evacuated 22 people from a mountain crash site in weather conditions that had grounded all other aircraft, using an older helicopter that others had dismissed as inadequate for challenging operations. But 8 people were still stranded on the mountain, and the weather conditions were continuing to worsen. The final trip would be the most dangerous yet, requiring her to operate in conditions that were beyond the limits of standard aviation procedures. The cargo pilot who had spent her career being told she wasn't qualified for important missions was about to attempt something that would define not just her own career, but the entire future of search and rescue operations at Fort Riverside. Colonel Walsh approached Sarah as she completed her post-flight checks and prepared for the final evacuation flight. "Chen, I want you to know that what you've accomplished today is extraordinary. You've already saved 22 lives in conditions that no other pilot could have handled. If you feel that the final trip is too dangerous, no one will question that decision." Sarah looked up from her checklist, considering the offer to terminate the mission with honor, and recognition for what she had already accomplished. It would be the safe decision, the reasonable decision, the decision that would protect her own life and preserve the aircraft for future operations. But 8 people were still on that mountain, and Sarah knew that they would die if she didn't get them off before conditions deteriorated further. The methodical approach that others had seen as a limitation was actually what enabled her to continue operating when others would have given up, because she understood exactly what she and her aircraft were capable of under the most extreme conditions. "Ma'am, I can make one more trip. Those people are counting on me, and I won't leave them to die because the weather's challenging." Colonel Walsh nodded, recognizing the same determination that had driven Sarah through 14 years of being underestimated and overlooked. "Then get them home, Chen. Bring everyone home." As Sarah began her pre-flight preparations for the final evacuation, she realized that her entire career had been leading to this moment. Every routine cargo mission, every hour of studying weather patterns and aircraft performance, every decision to be conservative and methodical rather than flashy and aggressive, had been preparation for a mission that would require her to operate beyond the boundaries of standard procedures while maintaining the precision and judgment that would keep everyone alive. The woman who had been dismissed as too slow, too cautious, and too methodical was about to prove that sometimes those very qualities were exactly what the situation demanded. The final trip to the mountain would be the most dangerous flight of her career, but it would also be the one that finally demonstrated what Sarah Chen was truly capable of when lives depended on her ability to do what everyone said couldn't be done. The final approach to the crash site represented everything that Sarah had learned about mountain flying condensed into 20 minutes of the most challenging aviation she had ever attempted. The weather had deteriorated beyond all forecasts, with winds now gusting to 50 knots and visibility reduced to less than 100 feet in blowing snow. Ice was accumulating on her aircraft despite all attempts to prevent it, and the cloud ceiling had dropped so low that she was forced to fly barely above the treetops to maintain visual contact with the terrain. But 8 people were still alive on that ridgeline, and Sarah could hear the desperation in their radio transmissions as hypothermia began claiming the last of their strength. The final group included Lieutenant Thompson, who had been conscious enough during the loading of previous evacuees to understand that the cargo pilot he had dismissed was now the only thing standing between him and death on a frozen mountain. "Dustoff 47, Eagle Flight. We can hear your engines, but visibility is 0 at our location. Several personnel are unconscious from cold exposure, and the rest of us are barely able to move. If you can't land in the next few minutes, we're not going to make it." Sarah's voice remained calm and professional despite the gravity of the situation. "Eagle Flight, Dustoff 47. I'm going to attempt a landing using ground-controlled approach. I need you to guide me in using verbal instructions. Can you see any part of my aircraft?" "Negative, Dustoff 47. We can hear you but cannot establish visual contact." What Sarah was about to attempt had never been successfully completed in conditions this severe. She would have to land a helicopter on a narrow mountain ridgeline, using only verbal guidance from personnel on the ground, in weather that made visual flying impossible and instrument approaches extremely dangerous. The margin for error was non-existent, and any mistake would result in her aircraft crashing into the same mountainside that had already claimed 1 helicopter and 47 lives. She began her descent through the clouds, using a technique that existed nowhere in any manual or training program, a combination of instrument flying and terrain awareness that she had developed through years of operating in marginal conditions. Sarah knew the topography around the crash site with the precision of someone who had studied every ridge, valley, and obstacle for miles. In every direction, she could visualize the terrain even when she couldn't see it, using radio altimeter readings and compass headings to navigate through space that was completely invisible. "Eagle Flight, I'm descending through 4,000 feet on a heading of 270. Call out when you hear my engines getting louder." "Dustoff 47. Engine noise is increasing. You sound like you're getting closer." Sarah continued her descent, fighting winds that were trying to push her aircraft into terrain she couldn't see while monitoring engine parameters that were being stressed by the combination of high altitude, adverse weather, and maximum performance demands. Ice was building up on her rotor blades, creating vibrations that threatened to tear the aircraft apart, but she had no choice except to continue the approach and hope that her heating systems could prevent catastrophic ice accumulation. "Eagle Flight, how does my engine noise sound now?" "Dustoff 47, you sound very close. I think you're almost directly overhead. Sarah was flying purely on instruments now, using her radio altimeter to judge height above the terrain while relying on compass headings and GPS coordinates to maintain position over the crash site. She began a careful descent, reducing power gradually while monitoring her descent rate to avoid flying into the ground too quickly to recover. At 200 feet above the estimated ground level, Sarah encountered the most severe turbulence of the entire mission. Wind shear caught her aircraft and threw it sideways with a violence that would have torn apart a less robust helicopter. She fought the controls with both hands, using maximum power to arrest a descent rate that threatened to become unrecoverable, while ice continued to accumulate on every surface of her aircraft. Eagle flight. I'm going to attempt to break through the cloud layer. If you see my aircraft, give me immediate guidance for landing approach. Dustoff 47, I can see your lights. You're about 100 yards to the east of the landing zone and maybe 50 feet too high. Sarah adjusted her position based on the ground guidance, fighting winds that were constantly changing direction and intensity. She could see nothing through her windscreen except swirling snow and ice, but she could feel the aircraft responding to control inputs and hear the engine sounds changing as she maneuvered closer to the ground. Eagle flight, how's my position now? Dustoff 47, you're directly over the landing zone but still too high. Come down slowly. The final descent was a masterpiece of precision flying under impossible conditions. Sarah reduced power incrementally, allowing the aircraft to settle toward the ground while maintaining perfect control despite winds that were gusting from multiple directions. She could feel the landing gear contact the ground through the flight controls, and immediately began the shutdown procedures that would allow the loading team to approach the aircraft safely. But when she opened the cabin door, Sarah was confronted with a scene that challenged everything she had prepared for. The 8 remaining survivors were in far worse condition than the radio transmissions had indicated. Several were unconscious from hypothermia, and the others were barely able to move without assistance. Loading them into the aircraft would require more time than she had planned, and time was something they didn't have as weather conditions continued to deteriorate around them. Master Sergeant Williams had remained at the crash site to coordinate the final evacuation, and his assessment of the situation was grimly realistic. Chen, half of these people are unconscious, and the other half can barely walk. It's going to take at least 15 minutes to get everyone loaded safely, and I'm not sure the weather is going to let you sit here that long. Sarah looked at the unconscious personnel who would need to be carried to her aircraft, understanding that 15 minutes on the ground in current conditions would expose her helicopter to ice accumulation and wind damage that could make takeoff impossible. But she also understood that attempting to rush the loading process could result in injuries to personnel who were already in critical condition. Williams will take as long as we need. These people have been through enough already. The loading process became a desperate race against conditions that were deteriorating by the minute. Williams and the few conscious survivors worked to move unconscious personnel from their shelter to the aircraft, while Sarah kept the engines running and monitored weather conditions that were approaching the limits of what any aircraft could survive. Ice was accumulating on her rotor blades faster than the heating systems could remove it, creating vibrations that were becoming dangerous. The wind was gusting with such violence that she had to maintain constant power to prevent the aircraft from being lifted off the ground and thrown against the mountainside. But slowly, methodically, the loading team managed to get all 8 remaining survivors into the cabin of Dustoff 47. Lieutenant Thompson was among the last to be loaded, conscious enough to recognize Sarah despite his hypothermic condition. "Chen," he managed to whisper as Williams secured him in the cabin. "I was wrong about you." "We were all wrong." Sarah nodded without speaking, focusing on the engine parameters and flight controls that would determine whether they all survived the next 30 minutes. The takeoff from the ridgeline would be the most challenging maneuver of her entire flying career, requiring her to lift off with maximum payload in conditions that were beyond the operating limits of any helicopter. The aircraft was now loaded with 8 personnel plus Williams, putting it well beyond normal weight limits for the current altitude and weather conditions. Sarah would have to use every technique she knew for maximum performance takeoffs, while dealing with icing conditions that could cause engine failure without warning, and winds that could slam the aircraft into the ground during the critical transition to forward flight. "Everyone secure for takeoff," she announced over the internal communication system. "This is going to be rough." The takeoff itself defied everything that conventional aviation wisdom said was possible. Sarah applied maximum power to the engines while carefully controlling the collective pitch to prevent over-torquing the transmission. The aircraft struggled to lift off under the combined weight of maximum payload and accumulated ice, requiring every available pound of thrust to break free from the ground. As Dustoff 47 finally became airborne, Sarah encountered wind shear that would have been fatal to a less experienced pilot. The aircraft was caught in a downdraft that threatened to slam it back into the ridgeline, forcing her to use emergency power settings that pushed the engines beyond their normal operating limits. She fought the controls with a precision that came from 14 years of learning to fly in conditions that other pilots avoided, gradually gaining enough altitude and airspeed to transition to forward flight. The departure from the crash site was conducted entirely on instruments, with visibility so poor that Sarah couldn't see beyond the nose of her aircraft. She climbed through clouds that were laden with ice and turbulence, following predetermined headings and altitudes that would take her safely away from the mountainous terrain while avoiding areas where radio navigation aids were unreliable. But the most challenging part of the mission was still ahead. The flight back to Fort Riverside would require her to navigate through the worst weather conditions she had ever encountered, while carrying a full load of hypothermic passengers who needed immediate medical attention. The aircraft was operating at the absolute limits of its performance capabilities, with ice accumulating faster than it could be removed, and engines that were stressed beyond normal operating parameters. 20 minutes into the return flight, Sarah faced a crisis that threatened to end the mission in disaster. The ice accumulation on her main rotor blades had reached the point where vibrations were becoming dangerous, and she could feel the aircraft beginning to lose lift as the airfoil shape of the blades was distorted by accumulated ice. Standard procedures called for immediate landing when ice accumulation reached these levels, but there were no suitable landing areas in the mountainous terrain below her position. Sarah made a decision that reflected the same methodical thinking that had characterized her entire approach to the rescue mission. Instead of following standard procedures that would have forced an emergency landing in unsuitable terrain, she began a series of flight maneuvers designed to break the ice accumulation off her rotor blades through controlled aerodynamic stresses. The technique was dangerous and unofficial, requiring her to deliberately stress her aircraft in ways that could cause structural failure if not executed perfectly. But Sarah had studied ice accumulation patterns and aerodynamic principles enough to understand exactly how much stress her aircraft could tolerate, and she had the flight experience to execute the maneuvers with the precision required to avoid disaster. The ice-shedding maneuvers worked, but they also attracted the attention of controllers at Fort Riverside who were monitoring her aircraft's unusual flight path on radar. Dustoff 47. Base operations. Your flight path shows some irregular patterns. Are you experiencing difficulties? Base operations, Dustoff 47. I'm dealing with icing conditions and performing maneuvers to maintain aircraft control. Request priority landing clearance for medical emergency. Dustoff 47, you are cleared for immediate approach to any runway. Medical personnel are standing by. The final approach to Fort Riverside was conducted in conditions that had shut down all other aircraft operations at the base. Sarah brought Dustoff 47 down through layers of clouds and precipitation that would have challenged any pilot. But her conservative flying techniques and methodical approach to risk management allowed her to complete the approach safely, despite conditions that were beyond normal operational limits. As the aircraft touched down on the helicopter landing pad at Fort Riverside, Sarah realized that she had just completed one of the most challenging rescue missions in military aviation history. She had evacuated 47 people from a mountain crash site in weather conditions that had grounded all other aircraft, using techniques and procedures that existed nowhere in any training manual. But more importantly, she had proven that the cargo pilot who had been dismissed as too slow, too cautious, and too methodical possessed exactly the skills and judgment that were required when lives depended on doing what everyone said couldn't be done. The woman who had spent her career being overlooked and underestimated had just demonstrated that sometimes the most important missions required exactly those qualities that others had seen as limitations. As medical personnel rushed to unload the hypothermic survivors from her aircraft, Sarah sat in the pilot's seat for a moment longer, processing what she had just accomplished. The routine cargo pilot had become the hero of a rescue mission that would be studied and remembered for years to come, proving that sometimes the person everyone overlooks is exactly the person everyone needs when everything depends on getting it right the first time. The demonstration that was supposed to showcase the capabilities of Fort Riverside's elite pilots had instead become a testament to the value of experience, preparation, and the kind of flying that existed beyond the boundaries of regulation and standard procedure. And the woman who had made it all possible was the same person who had been told just days earlier that she wasn't qualified to advise combat search and rescue crews because she was only a cargo pilot who flew in perfect weather conditions. General Hayes was waiting as Sarah finally shut down the engines of Dustoff 47, and his expression showed the kind of respect that she had never seen from a senior officer during her entire military career. The final phase of this extraordinary day was about to begin, and Sarah was finally going to receive the recognition that her skills and dedication had always deserved. General Robert Hayes stood beside Dustoff 47 as Sarah completed her post-flight checklist, his uniform soaked from the freezing rain that continued to fall across Fort Riverside. Behind him, medical personnel were rushing the last of the hypothermic survivors into heated ambulances, their efficient movements a stark contrast to the chaos that had defined the previous 6 hours. The general's expression was unreadable as he waited for Sarah to emerge from the cockpit, but the congressional staffers and defense contractors who had witnessed the entire rescue operation were already discussing what they had seen with the kind of intensity that suggested careers and policies might be changed by the day's events. Sarah finally opened the cockpit door and stepped down onto the tarmac, her flight suit stained with hydraulic fluid, and her face showing the exhaustion that came from 6 hours of flying in conditions that had pushed both her and her aircraft beyond their documented limits. She expected the usual post-mission debrief that followed any significant operation, but what she found instead was a gathering that included not just the base leadership, but also the visiting officials who had come to witness a routine demonstration and instead observed something far more significant. Specialist Chen, General Hayes said as she approached, his voice carrying an authority that made everyone within earshot stop what they were doing to listen. I need to understand what just happened here. You completed 4 flights to a crash site in weather conditions that grounded every other aircraft on this base, evacuated 47 personnel, including several who would have died without immediate medical attention, and did it all using an aircraft that most people would consider obsolete for challenging operations. Sarah straightened to attention, unsure whether she was about to be commended or disciplined for violating numerous regulations during the rescue mission. Yes, sir. The situation required immediate action, and I had the capability to reach the crash site safely. Safely? General Hayes raised an eyebrow. According to the weather data and operational reports I've been reviewing, what you did today was technically impossible. No helicopter should have been able to operate in those conditions, especially not with the payload requirements you were dealing with. Colonel Walsh stepped forward, her expression showing the kind of protective concern that indicated she was prepared to defend Sarah's actions against any criticism. General Specialist Chen's performance today was exceptional by any measure. She saved lives that would have been lost if we had waited for conventional rescue assets to become available. I'm not questioning her performance, Colonel, General Hayes replied. I'm trying to understand how one pilot was able to accomplish something that our entire operational doctrine says is impossible. Either our doctrine is wrong, or Specialist Chen has capabilities that we haven't recognized or utilized properly. The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing Sarah to articulate something she had never been asked to explain during 14 years of military service. How did a cargo pilot develop the skills necessary to complete missions that elite pilots couldn't attempt? How did someone who had been systematically excluded from advanced training and challenging assignments become the most capable rescue pilot on the base when conditions demanded exceptional performance? Sir, Sarah began carefully, I've spent my entire career flying in conditions that other pilots avoid. Cargo missions don't get canceled because of weather, and medical evacuations can't wait for perfect conditions. I've learned to operate safely in situations that training programs don't cover because the missions I've been assigned required me to develop those capabilities. General Hayes nodded thoughtfully, beginning to understand the implications of what Sarah was describing. You're saying that being relegated to routine missions actually gave you more challenging flying experience than the pilots we consider our most qualified? In some ways, yes, sir. Elite pilots get to choose their missions and avoid dangerous conditions. Cargo pilots have to complete their assignments regardless of weather, terrain, or aircraft limitations. Over 14 years, that experience adds up to capabilities that aren't reflected in standard qualifications or training records. The general's expression shifted as he processed this explanation, recognizing the systemic problem that Sarah's rescue mission had inadvertently exposed. The military's approach to pilot development had created a situation where the most challenging flying was being done by the people who were considered least qualified for important missions, while the pilots who were designated as elite were actually less prepared for the kinds of conditions that real emergencies demanded. Specialist Chen, General Hayes said after a long pause, "I want you to walk me through exactly how you planned and executed today's mission. I need to understand the techniques and procedures you used, because what you accomplished today is going to change how we think about rescue operations and pilot training." For the next 2 hours, Sarah found herself in the unprecedented position of briefing senior military officials and civilian defense experts on flying techniques that she had developed through years of practical experience. She explained her approach to weather analysis, terrain assessment, and risk management in conditions that existed beyond the boundaries of standard training programs. Her detailed knowledge of aircraft performance, navigation techniques, and emergency procedures impressed officials who were beginning to understand that they had been overlooking capabilities that were crucial for military aviation effectiveness. Lieutenant Thompson, who had been treated for hypothermia and released from the medical facility, arrived during the briefing looking pale but determined to participate in the discussion. His presence added a personal dimension to the technical analysis, as he was able to describe the conditions at the crash site and the impact of Sarah's rescue efforts from the perspective of someone whose life had depended on her capabilities. "General," Thompson said when given the opportunity to speak, "I need to acknowledge something that's difficult for me to admit. I dismissed Specialist Chen's warnings about weather conditions because I assumed that cargo pilots weren't qualified to evaluate complex flight operations. That assumption nearly cost the lives of everyone on the demonstration mission." Thompson's statement created an uncomfortable silence in the briefing room, as it forced everyone present to confront the possibility that their own assumptions about pilot qualifications and mission assignments might be fundamentally flawed. The young lieutenant, who had been considered one of the most promising pilots in the program, was admitting that his judgment had been inferior to that of the cargo pilot he had dismissed. "Lieutenant," General Hayes said carefully, "are you saying that Specialist Chen's assessment of weather conditions was more accurate than the official briefings and planning for the demonstration mission?" "Yes, sir. She tried to warn us that the weather would be more dangerous than forecasted, and she tried to offer briefings on mountain flying techniques that could have prevented the crash. We ignored her input because we assumed that her experience wasn't relevant to combat search and rescue operations." The implications of Thompson's admission were staggering. The demonstration mission had failed not because of equipment problems or unforeseeable circumstances, but because the most experienced mountain pilot on the base had been excluded from mission planning and crew briefings. The accident that had endangered 47 lives could have been prevented if the cargo pilot's expertise had been valued and utilized appropriately. Colonel Walsh recognized the broader significance of what was being revealed. "General, I think we need to examine our entire approach to pilot assignment and training. We may be systematically underutilizing our most capable personnel because we're measuring qualifications based on mission prestige rather than actual flying competence." "That's exactly what we're going to do," General Hayes replied. "I'm ordering a comprehensive review of pilot utilization and training standards across this command. But first, we need to address the immediate situation." The general turned to face Sarah directly, his expression showing the kind of respect that she had never experienced from senior leadership during her entire military career. "Specialist Chen, effective immediately, you are being assigned as the senior flight instructor for high-risk rescue operations. Your first responsibility will be developing training programs that incorporate the techniques and procedures you used during today's mission." The announcement was so unexpected that Sarah initially thought she had misunderstood. After 14 years of being relegated to routine missions and told that she wasn't qualified for important assignments, she was suddenly being placed in charge of training the same elite pilots who had previously dismissed her capabilities. "Sir, I appreciate the confidence, but I should point out that I don't have the formal qualifications normally required for instructor positions." "Specialist Chen," General Hayes smiled for the first time since arriving at Fort Riverside, "after today, I think we need to reconsider what qualifications actually matter for military aviation. Your formal qualifications may be limited, but your demonstrated capabilities are exactly what we need for the challenges we're facing." The transformation that followed was swift and comprehensive. Within a week, Sarah found herself leading seminars for the same pilots who had previously questioned her competence, teaching techniques for weather flying and risk assessment that hadn't been part of standard training programs. The methodical approach that had been seen as a limitation was now recognized as the foundation for operating safely in conditions that challenged conventional procedures. Lieutenant Thompson was among the first to request additional training from Sarah, acknowledging that his previous attitudes had been based on ignorance rather than informed evaluation of capabilities. "Chen," he said after completing his first advanced weather flying lesson, "I need to apologize for how I treated you. I realize now that I was confusing confidence with competence, and almost got people killed because of it." Sarah accepted the apology with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her response to years of dismissive treatment. "Jake, the important thing is that everyone learned from what happened. Good pilots are always willing to learn from people who have more experience, regardless of their official qualifications." The new training program that Sarah developed became a model for military aviation training across multiple bases. Her emphasis on practical flying skills, conservative decision-making, and thorough preparation for challenging conditions produced pilots who were significantly more capable in real-world emergency situations than those trained under previous programs. Master Sergeant Williams, who had been Sarah's strongest supporter throughout her career, was promoted to Chief of Maintenance Operations and given authority to implement aircraft preparation standards that reflected the lessons learned during the rescue mission. His recognition of Sarah's capabilities before they were officially acknowledged had positioned him as a leader in the transformation of the base's operational philosophy. 6 months after the rescue mission, General Hayes returned to Fort Riverside for a follow-up evaluation that would determine whether the changes implemented at the base should be adopted throughout the UH military aviation system. What he found was a program that had been completely transformed, with pilots who were demonstrably more competent in challenging conditions, and a training philosophy that emphasized practical skills over theoretical knowledge. "The results speak for themselves," General Hayes announced during the final briefing of his visit. "Accident rates are down, mission completion rates are up, and pilot confidence in challenging conditions has improved dramatically. The techniques developed by Chief Warrant Officer Chen have become the new standard for military rescue operations." Sarah had been promoted twice during the 6 months following the rescue mission, advancing from specialist to Chief Warrant Officer in recognition of her technical expertise and leadership capabilities. She now commanded the respect of pilots who had previously dismissed her, and her input was actively sought by senior leadership on matters ranging from aircraft procurement to training program development. But perhaps the most significant change was in Sarah herself. The quiet confidence that had sustained her through years of being underestimated had evolved into the assured leadership of someone who understood her own capabilities and was no longer willing to accept limitations imposed by others' misconceptions. The woman who had been told she was too slow, too cautious, and too methodical for important missions had become the architect of a new approach to military aviation that valued those exact qualities. Her rescue of 47 personnel from a mountain crash site in impossible weather conditions had proven that sometimes the most important missions required exactly the skills that others had dismissed as limitations. As Sarah stood on the flight line at Fort Riverside, watching new pilots practice the techniques she had developed, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from cargo missions to command responsibility. The aircraft around her were newer and more sophisticated than Dustoff 47, but they were being flown by pilots who understood that technology was no substitute for judgment, experience, and the kind of methodical preparation that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The demonstration that was supposed to showcase conventional military aviation had instead revealed the limitations of that approach and established new standards for what military pilots should be capable of achieving. And the woman who had made it all possible was no longer the overlooked cargo pilot who cleaned up after more important operations, but the senior instructor who was shaping the future of military aviation one careful, methodical lesson at a time. The range would remember her mission long after the details faded, but more importantly, every pilot trained in her methods would carry forward the understanding that real competence came not from avoiding challenges, but from developing the skills necessary to handle them safely and successfully. The courage to acknowledge that conventional wisdom might be wrong, and the determination to do what others said couldn't be done, had proven to be exactly what the situation demanded when 47 lives hung in the balance and everything depended on getting it right the first time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.